very much for inviting me, especially the faculty and the school for having me here to be able to talk about my research. I'm very excited to be here and to receive your comments and your feedback and your questions. So this paper, evaluating the changing of the guard survey evidence of female racial balancing policies in Liberia, it's a paper that is part of the broader research agenda on security sector reform in post-conflict countries. And the paper kind of came into fruition after a few visits to Liberia and working with the Liberian National Police and also the UN mission in Liberia there. And the way that I go about it is I'm looking at a particular reform in the security sector, and I'm going to use survey methodology to analyze the questions in this particular paper. So moving forward, the motivation for this paper and then also kind of the broader research agenda really comes from stories like this. This is a picture of Mark. Mark is a friend of mine. He is a State Department-sponsored trainer. He's a contractor by the State Department, and his job is to train and help implement reforms in the domestic security sector of Liberia. In particular, here he's training a specialized force of the Liberian National Police, the Emergency Response Unit, which is kind of like the national SWAT team, basically. Now, the US has been heavily involved in the restructuring, the reforming, the funding, and the training of the Liberian National Police since the end of the war. So they were solely the reason behind the creation of the Emergency Response Unit, another unit which is called the Police Response Unit, which is there for the riots, and the DEA as well. The US is not the only actor that's involved kind of with a heavy hand in security sector reform in Liberia. The UN mission is also very heavily involved in security sector reform in Liberia. We'd also see these kinds of activities both on the part of the UN and on the US in other post-conflict countries. So the US is very heavily involved in the restructuring, the reforming, the training, and the funding of security sectors all over the world. We need to only look at Iraq, Afghanistan to see that. Right, as well as the UN, I should mention, is also very heavily involved. The question then is, have these reforms, has this restructuring been successful? And unfortunately, this is a headline from the New York Times earlier this month. The answer is really kind of disconcerting. It's no. This particular article talks about how billions of dollars has basically been wasted on trying to reform the security sectors of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. So much so that the current ambassador has even stated that our track record at building security forces over the past 15 years is miserable. So those are pretty strong words and kind of really disconcerting given the fact that this is probably going to be a policy that we will continue on in the future and that the UN will continue to do in the future. So the question then really becomes, how do we become more successful? This is the policy question that's, I think, important here. And that's the broader research question that I'm looking at in this paper and then in the project, which is, do certain domestic security sector reforms then help lead to legitimacy for the state? Now, there's a whole host of reforms that I could look at. In this particular paper, I'm just looking at gender reforms. So I'm looking at female racial balancing policies, which I'll get into what that is later on. But just know right now that the specific question is, do gender reforms in the domestic security sector help restore confidence in the domestic security sector? To give you a preview of the argument, in Liberia, I do find some evidence for this kind of mechanism, the fact that if you do implement these policies, then that might actually help enhance confidence in some parts of the population there. To get at the findings, so today I'm going to go over a theoretical framework for looking at security sector reform. I'll test some hypotheses. I also then will go into the research design, which I've already mentioned is a survey. I'll go over the results, conclusion, and I'll provide you some policy implications. And I'll tie this paper into the broader research agenda that I have. Okay, so before moving forward, I need to define what I mean by the security sector. And this is basically any organization or entity that has the ability or the authorization to use force against the population. So this can be anything from the police, the military, specialized forces, state-sponsored militias, or civilian bodies that oversee the bodies that can use force or that have use arms, basically. Security sector reform is defined broadly here, which is any institutional change that happens to the security sector. Now, there's a reason for defining it so broadly and kind of loosely. It's so that I can encompass any kind of change that actually happens and theorize more deeply about kind of creating a typology for reforms, but then also, putting them into categories to analyze which ones might be more useful for post-conflict adoption by states. There's some background on security sector reform. I mean, there's a lot of policy work that's been done, and less so on the academic side. But I want to start off, obviously, by looking at the definition of what the state is. Weber, defines it as any body that has a monopoly over the legitimate use of force. So there's two parts to that definition, right? So having a body that can use force, but then also making sure that civilians and citizens within the state find that body legitimate, as accepting that body as having that use of force ability. Now, Lake has a forthcoming book that uses this idea. It's called The State Builder's Dilemma, and he basically argues that when it comes to state building, we should really kind of prioritize the security sector. And there's all kinds of problems that come along with that, and he talks about that in the book. But it's basically this argument that there should be a way that state building is done that prioritizes security first, very similar to kind of what Weber talks about, or how he defines the state. There's a whole host of literature on military capacity and conflict. So, the more state capacity measured in this sense is military capacity, the less likely is interstate war, less likely is civil war, and less likely is interstate war as well. And then there's one book by Monica Toft, Securing the Peace, that looks at security sector reform dichotomously. So she just looks at, if you implement security sector reform, does that lead to longer peace duration? She finds that it does. But she doesn't disaggregate different kinds of reforms. And finally, there's a whole other set of literature that looks at civilian control over the military. This has more to do with coup proofing, coup prevention. So you can see that there's lots of different strands of literature that talk about the security sector. They're not really kind of brought together, right? So, on one hand, we need to increase the size of the military, maybe, but at the other, on the other hand, we need to do, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, says Monica Toft. So we don't have a coherent understanding of security sector reform in general, and that's where I'm trying to fill the gap with this paper and with other papers. Okay, so what is the end goal? We come back to, what is the point of doing security sector reform? Well, it's obviously to ensure peace and stability, but it's also really to make sure that people find the security sector legitimate. We want to restructure and create a security force that people buy into, that people have confidence in, not one that they're afraid of. And so in this paper, I'm defining legitimacy in two ways. I'm measuring it in two ways. The first is when people prefer the state security forces over a third party, so over a peacekeeping mission or over American forces or something like that to respond to their security threats, then there's maybe legitimacy, there's more buy-in. And then when they choose the state apparatus or the state security forces over informal means of conflict resolution, so civilian defense forces, things that appear organically, another such thing. So when people choose the state over other options, then I think there's legitimacy. The second way to measure it is to look at preferences about the third party. So when the peacekeeping mission or when the third party leaves, or when people prefer those entities to leave, then you might think that they're actually confident in what's there on the ground, they're confident in the domestic security sector, so they're okay with this third party leaving. We no longer need protection, right, from this third party. So then I'm going to move into how I put this all together. So basically, we have a wartime security sector that in most cases and in most civil wars, the government was involved in a lot of the atrocities, involved in repression, involved in rape, torture, killings. And so people tend to mistrust the government forces, right? They tend to fear them. Oftentimes, they look a particular way. So here, these are actually soldiers that were part of the state-sponsored militias, essentially. They maybe were not trained, they weren't integrated into regular forces, they were unprofessional. So we have a way that the security forces look during the wartime and the way that they are. Then the state enacts some kind of a reform, right? And that can be a broad range of things, like I've already mentioned. And then that may or may not lead to the outcomes that we're interested in, which one is legitimacy. If we want legitimacy, that means that there has to be something about the reform, right? The reform has to do some work here in order to change people's perceptions. And I argue that there's three mechanisms through which that might be possible. The first is restraint. The second is is inclusiveness. And the third is visible transformation. So let me walk you through those three mechanisms. Okay, so the first one is restraint. So again, we have a wartime security sector that was implicated in a lot of violence during the war. So people mistrust it. There's a lot of fear. Then the state implements a reform, and in this case, this reform decreases the likelihood that the state is able to repress or abuse the population. So this might be things like actually abolishing the military, which has happened in a few countries, or decreasing the size, or getting rid of the units that were responsible for atrocities. It might mean disarmament and demobilization and reintegration programs. So there's a number of reforms that kind of embody this idea of restraint, which then, if you do this, then maybe the civilians then perceive the security forces as not being as threatening as previously, because you've done some kind of reform to try to address these issues of fear, and then that might lead to legitimacy. The second mechanism is inclusiveness. So again, you have a security force during the wartime. And in this case, this is a picture of Charles Taylor, and he's surrounded by the infamous anti-terrorist unit, which was basically a personalized security force for himself and those in power. And so in the wartime, oftentimes you have a security force that's only there to protect a small group of people, specifically those in power. Right? They're not interested about providing protection to civilians. They're not interested in addressing wider security needs, those related to human security, like rape, domestic violence, other things that are going on. They're just there to really kind of protect those in power. So then in the post-conflict phase, if the state implements a reform that embodies inclusiveness, one that addresses the needs of a wider population base, so not just those that are in power, but now we're actually providing security to civilians, not just in the form of protection, how we traditionally think of it, but also providing security for a wider range of things that previously were ignored, like rape and domestic violence and other gender-based crimes. That then may lead to legitimacy. So some examples of reforms of inclusiveness might be, having new units created, having a criminal investigation division, in your police force, which then can investigate crimes, or having a women and children's protection unit created to address gender-based violence. So these are all reforms that can happen that address the fact that previously security was really personalized. Finally, the mechanism of visible transformation. So again, you have a wartime security sector that looks a particular way. And when I say looks a particular way, I mean literally looks a particular way. So maybe there was only one ethnic group. Maybe they were all state-sponsored militias. So they weren't in uniform. They weren't professionalized. You can recognize kind of what they look like, what the wartime security sector looked like. But then the state implements a reform that is visible, literally visible. Like you can see the change from what was there before to what's there now, and this signals a reform. And when you need some kind of mechanism, so you can implement all the reforms you want, right? But if people don't know that these reforms are taking place, that's not really going to change anything. So you need some way to communicate that reform, and so some reforms are visible, literally visible, so they signal a change. And this then might lead to legitimacy, okay? Because people see that there's a change, literally see that there's a change, so they now have buy-in, and they're okay with the third force leaving. Okay. So the example here might be ethnic balancing. So you had one minority group. You knew that there was only one minority group in the security forces, and then later with the reform, there's more plurality in the ethnic groups that are there. So and that's a visible change. You see that now your ethnic group is maybe represented, right? So now this might lead to legitimacy. Okay, so I've given you lots of examples of reforms. And I'm going to look particularly at one reform, female ratio balancing, which is the increase in proportions of women relative to men in different institutions, in this case particularly the security sector. And And these might take the form of gender quotas. They might take the form of opening up positions that were previously excluded to women, or they might be informal recruitment drives for women. Just to give you an idea of the distribution of these kinds of reforms. So I've created a data set, like I mentioned on, I don't know if I mentioned, but I have created a data set on security sector reforms cross-nationally from 1989 to 2012, and one of the reforms included in that data set are female racial balancing policies. This uses this looks at post-conflict countries from 1989 to 2012. So in the red are countries that have implemented some form of a female racial balancing policy, and in the gray are countries that have not. You can see that there's a lot of red on the map. So this suggests that we need to really be thinking about these kinds of policies and whether they're appropriate in these countries, whether they might be nascent in their stages, kind of theorizing about female racial balancing policies and gender policies in the security sector more generally. We saw an uptake of these kinds of reforms with the passing of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which is the seminal UN resolution on women, peace, and security. This was passed in 2000. And so the implication might be that this is a kind of a reform that's top-down. So we have the idea of the second image, but this might be a case of the second image reversed in the IR literature. Instead of domestic politics affecting international politics, this is actually international politics affecting domestic politics. And there's actually evidence for that. So if a post-conflict country has a peacekeeping mission, it's actually much more likely to adopt gender reforms, and specifically female racial balancing. Now, this is actually an important point because there's literature out there that suggests that if there's a top-down approach to security sector reform or peace building more generally, that might clash with what locals really feel like they need, right? So we need to really evaluate whether this is the best policy to be implementing, given that it is kind of a top-down approach. Okay, so how does female racial balancing embody these three mechanisms? Here I rely on the idea of gender stereotypes for the first two mechanisms. So first, you implement a reform. That means that more people are going to come into contact with women, which then may change perceptions due to gender stereotypes about women, being less likely to use violence, or being more restrained than men, or less likely to use excessive violence. I am by no means suggesting that women are actually that way, that they are actually more peaceful or that they are more restrained, but that perception is there. It's the perception that's important, and there's a lot of literature that supports that idea that at least women are perceived in this particular way. And so if more women are integrated into the security forces, then they might perceive the entire security force to be more restrained, right? So the hypothesis is that when you have contact with a female officer, you're going to be more likely to prefer the police force, in this case, to respond to security, and particularly security situations where we might think there might have been excessive violence prior, right? So they're trying to correct for past grievances. These are the situations where you might be able to correct for them by integrating women, because then you might not see the security forces as so threatening. The second hypothesis, to give you an example of this in action. This is actually important. So I was in Liberia when Ebola broke out last year, and I had the opportunity to go to the first checkpoint created between counties. And there were two observations that relate to this idea of restraint and female racial balancing. So here, there's women, and it looks like they're carrying weapons, but these are not. These are actually less lethal weapons. So these are for tear gas. And only the women were given the less lethal, even though they're all trained the same, but only the women had the less lethal weapons. And then also, there were crowds gathering on both sides of the checkpoint. And when they approached the security forces, they actually always tended to approach the women first. So this is, I spent a lot of time, a few hours here, and this is the observation that I had. So this kind of brings this point home, I think, that there really may be this idea of restraint. People do perceive women as more approachable because they don't feel like they're going to get hurt. Okay, so the inclusiveness, again, you implement this policy, there's more women, so you come into contact with women. This may enhance your perceptions because of the stereotype that maybe women are better at handling certain types of situations that were ignored previously, right? So I'm particularly thinking of gender-based crimes here, rape, domestic violence. Again, I'm not suggesting that women are better at these things, but that perception might be there, right? So the hypothesis is that when individuals have contact with women, they're going to be more likely to want the police to respond to rape and domestic violence because now they know that women are in the security forces and they can address these needs that were previously ignored. To give you an example of this in action, I got to go on a patrol with, in this case, female peacekeepers, and Harriet, who's the Ugandan peacekeeper next to me, she and I went to a police station, and there was a Liberian woman there who was trying to report a case of rape, and the male police officer who was there, he was not having it. He refused to take the case, and so Harriet convinced him that he needed to do that, and then she actually followed up on the case afterwards. So, you know, had it not been for maybe, in quotes, right, this woman there, this female touch to this particular issue, then it may not have gotten resolved. So this is kind of an example of this in action. Finally, visible transformation. So again, you implement the policy, there's more women in the security forces. This then may lead to preferences about the third party leaving because there were no women in the security forces before. So it's a visible change. It's literally a visible change that you can notice. And that signals that the reform has been implemented fully, and so now maybe the third party is no longer necessary. So the hypothesis is that when individuals have contact with women, they're going to be less likely to prefer the peacekeeping mission to extend. Right? Okay. So there's obviously some counter-arguments that I want to go over that are important. So if we're going to use a gender stereotyping mechanism, then it might work in the opposite way. Right? So if you think of women as more restrained, more peaceful, then maybe you also don't perceive them as effective, right? So then we would see a negative relationship if that's the case. Maybe there's no gender stereotypes because women are perpetrators of violence, in which case we shouldn't see any kind of relationship. And then finally, I make this assumption that when you have contact, or when you see a visible transformation, that's always going to be positive. That may not be the case, right? So maybe you see this reform and you think it's the wrong reform, you disagree with it, so then you're likely to have negative perceptions of the state. So the example here is Afghanistan, where you had a female racial balancing policy, so there were more women integrated into the police force, then there were a lot of policewomen that were actually murdered for being women, right? And in a society where maybe it wasn't acceptable for that integration to happen, people responded by killing the women. So obviously that's not the response that we want. That's not buying legitimacy in the state at all. So there might be some conditions under which these policies might not be working. And that's important to take into consideration. That's something I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A as well. Okay, so now I'm going to go into how I measure these hypotheses, test these hypotheses. I do it in Liberia, and I use a survey. I had a case study, country's Liberia, and just to give you a little bit of background, there was a civil war on and off between 1989 and 2003. It was a particularly brutal civil war with over 250,000 people dying. There's a lot of torture and rape and other things going on as well. There was a peacekeeping mission that came in 2003. There was lots of different security bodies at the end of the war, so and all of the institutions were basically destroyed. Liberia is not, however, the only country that experienced this kind of a war. Other countries, Sierra Leone, DRC, Cote d'Ivoire, Haiti, South Sudan currently even, Mali, et cetera. So it's one case of many that looks like this. However, Liberia is a most likely case. So the point of this paper is to demonstrate that there is some weight to this theory, right? So this does actually happen. And I'm testing in the most likely case with the thought that then we can test it in other places where particular conditions might not be so amenable to seeing some kind of an effect. And it's a most likely case because there's been such a focus on gender in Liberia. So before the war, there were hardly any women in the police force. There were about 2%, maybe less. And then afterwards, after the war, with the help of the UN, they instituted a quota system for women in the police force. So now there's a 30% quota. We've reached 19% right now. And then there's just been a whole host of other reforms. There's been a special court to address sexual violence. There's been task force, numerous task forces on SGBV. They've created a Women and Children's Protection Unit. So there's been really a lot of emphasis on gender reforms in the security sector. So if there's going to be some kind of effect, we should really see something here in Liberia. Okay. Let me get into sampling very quickly. So I was very, very intentional with my sampling because there's no point in trying to sample a population that already thinks of the police force in a positive way or has positive perceptions of the state. So I was trying to find groups that have a very low baseline of trust. So I look at these two communities, which are ex-combatant anti-government communities in Monrovia, Peace Island, and West Point. And they're ex-combatant because after the war, there was a disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program, and people received some money, and they tended to actually settle in these two communities. They settled other places, but these were kind of the two main areas. These are informal communities. They're in constant threat of eviction. And so, you know, I thought, okay, this is a good place to test it because people are not likely to have a positive perception of the government. And so maybe a reform will do good. I also, however, test this in the rural counties just for some external validity. And so that's that. I had a very rigorous sampling methodology. So I used Google Earth to create grids in the two communities and then randomly sampled grids and households and then individuals within them. One thing to really point out, though, is that I, again, had a targeted population within these two communities of people that just experienced a dispute. So I'm going to say that again. Only people that experience some sort of dispute were included in the survey. And that's because I was trying to get at those people that were most likely to have contact with police officers. Okay, so we're just looking at a population of people that live in ex-combatant communities that have experienced some kind of dispute. Okay. The specific survey question that I asked was, have you interacted with a female LNP officer? I also asked whether you've had contact with a police officer. So I have 3 categories: male-only contact, female-only contact, and then no contact. The survey questions for the dependent variable are, who do you think should provide security to the community? Who do you think is most likely to provide security when there's armed violence? And then who do you think can best protect you from being raped? There were lots of possibilities for what they could answer. They were kind of given this list, and then if they said police, that's what was counted. And then for the last hypothesis on, or the last way to measure legitimacy, they were asked if the UN should extend the mission, and they agreed to that statement or disagreed. Okay. There's control variables that I include in the model. The important ones here are preferences about traditional leaders, which is this measure about valuing informal versus formal means of conflict resolution, perceptions about the UN mission, so whether or not they thought the UN mission had done a good job, sex, age, and then views about women's empowerment, which is a series of questions about women's roles in society, and the number of disputes, and whether or not they had contact with a female peacekeeper. And the model is a legit model. Okay, so let me go into the results very quickly. So what I have here is a predicted probability table. So I'm going to walk you through it. If you had no contact with a female police officer, you were 82% likely to say that you want the police to provide security. That number goes up by about 15% when you had contact with female officers. Okay, so with police responding to armed violence, you were 80% likely to say that you wanted the police to respond to armed violence if you had no contact with women. And then that goes up again to 95% if you had contact with a female officer. The last row is the external validity. That's the question that was asked in the rural counties. So the question was, if you've ever, who do you want to have respond to a hala hala, which is a dispute between communities? And so if they answered police, if you had no contact with women, they were 25% likely to say they want the police to respond, and then 44% likely to say that if they had contact with a police officer, female police officer. Okay. So there's actually no evidence for the second mechanism of inclusiveness using the variables that I have talked about already. So contact with women does not lead to people preferring the police to respond to rape. However, there is still some evidence for this using different measures from the survey. So I do find that if a female police officer has extended contact with the person, so they actually take the case instead of just it being contact, they want a female police officer to respond to rape. So it doesn't do much for the institution as a whole, but it does suggest that people still want the police to respond, but they just want women to be responding to rape. Okay. Then this last hypothesis about visible transformation. So again, if you have contact with women, that's going to lead you to want the peacekeeping mission to leave, or at least not want it to extend. And there's actually pretty significant results for this. So if you have contact with a female officer, you're 64% likely to say that you want UNMIL to extend. That number goes down by a lot when you have contact with women. So if you have contact with a female officer, you are much less likely to want the peacekeeping mission to extend. Okay, so I've shown you kind of evidence for these different mechanisms here. So if female racial balancing policies are the reforms that we're interested in, then you have contact with women that leads to enhanced perceptions directly. It also leads directly to preferences about the third party leaving. So those are the two ways that I've measured legitimacy. And then there's also actually evidence for having enhanced perceptions of the domestic security forces leading to preferences about the third party leaving. So that makes intuitive sense, right? So if you're more confident in the domestic security sector, then you're okay with the peacekeeping mission to leave. Right? So there could be an indirect way or a direct way that these policies are having an impact. The big takeaway, there's kind of two big takeaways, I think, coming from this study. Right? The first is that any kind of approach to security sector reform is going to, and state building really should include gender reforms because they kind of do tend to meet these three criteria that I've talked about. And then in general, any kind of comprehensive approach to state building and security sector reform might actually need to include these three mechanisms. So we can think of other reforms and kind of evaluate whether they meet the restraint, the inclusiveness, and the visible transformation mechanisms or not. And future research really should look into whether or not all three mechanisms are needed. Maybe just one is needed, maybe two is needed, but kind of the necessary and sufficient conditions under which the reforms might enhance perceptions based off of these three criteria. So there's a few policy recommendations that might come out of this. Again, if we come back to the very first slide that I talked about, which is that we have America at the US and we have the UN trying to do state building and especially security sector reform in other countries. So we have limited resources. That means we need to prioritize the kinds of reforms that we're doing. So here we might think that we might want to start out with reforms that focus on restraint and inclusiveness and that focus on visible transformation. Especially, right, okay, so maybe these policies don't have to happen countrywide because maybe conflicts don't actually, not all civil wars are large scale and embody the entire country. But I have shown you that in communities where there's mistrust in the government, these could have real leverage, right? So ex-combatant communities, communities where, maybe informal communities, these are the places where these kinds of reforms might be most useful. So maybe you don't do a national reform, but you do targeted reforms regionally or in specific areas. And so there's some suggestion that maybe female racial balancing policies are one way to start in countries like Liberia, in communities that are similar to the one that I looked at. And then it's possible to maybe even extend this theory and this idea of, and this way of looking at security sector reform to countries that aren't traditionally considered conflict countries, but that have still experienced a high level of violence, government violence specifically, in response to criminal activity, places like Mexico, El Salvador, and Honduras right now. And so just to end very quickly to tie this paper to my broader research agenda, which is first on security sector reform in post-conflict countries. I'm looking at these issues and kind of theorizing about it much more deeply in the book project. which then also includes some other empirical aspects, such as I have 2 ongoing field experiments in Liberia right now, where I'm randomizing police patrols in 4 counties. I've already created a cross-national data set of security sector reforms from 1989 to 2012. And I have 2 working papers. One looks at when post-conflict states adopt certain kinds of reforms over others. And then the other one is going to look at whether there's particular reforms that lead to longer peace duration. So maybe it's not just that security sector reform is a dichotomous variable, right? There may be some reforms that perform better than others. And then I've already conducted the lab in the field experiments with 800 police officers. So this looks at 2 reforms, female racial balancing again, but also ethnic balancing, which is looking at the integration of minority groups in the Liberian National Police, and how that affects performance internally. So if you have groups that are composed of women and men, groups that are composed of minority and majority ethnic groups, does that improve or decrease group performance? And then finally, this paper also ties into my other research agenda, which is on gender, conflict, and peacekeeping. So I have the forthcoming book, which is very exciting, and then a few other papers, co-authored papers that look at these issues as well. So with that, Thank you, and I'd love to take your questions.
Oh, Miles Taylor, I'm the professor here. Really interesting talk and very interesting research design. I had 2 questions. One is, does this depend on the type of internal conflict and the source of insecurity? Because you're assuming, I think, that the state is in some sense the primary source of insecurity in the eyes of many of these people. But what about just crime? And the possibility that if there's a different type of conflict where the state breaks down and crime surges, as it often does after an authoritarian regime breaks down, then this restraint may not appear so positive for people because they want an effective police force that's going to get the criminals. So restraint may not be bad. The other issue is about the gender balancing. I mean, is it possible that these positive effects take place just because women are new in these police forces? And as they become socialized into the police force, they become just like every other policeman or policewoman, and eventually become as corrupt, as brutal, as unrestrained as the men. So, then the stereotype would change over time and the whole effect disappears. So there's a kind of, fading of this effect over time.
Sir, those are very good questions. How are we going to take lots of questions or
Why don't we start, there's 2 there, so why don't you start with us,
okay.
And then we'll go to...
Perfect. This is actually, the first point is actually very important. And so in this paper, the scope conditions were really focused on countries that experienced violence by the state previously. In the broader project, I include effectiveness as another criteria. So the title of the book is going to be The Goldilocks Problem, because I think there's this really interesting trade-off between restraint and effectiveness. So if if you focus on one thing, then you're foregoing the other, right? So you need to find this delicate balance when you're implementing reforms, and how do you do that? So the field experiments are actually designed to get at kind of testing that. So I look at, I'm randomizing police patrols by sex. So there might be the idea that women can kind of do both, because you're increasing the size of the forces when you include more women. So it could be seen as effective, right? But then you have the stereotype that might be working, which could be seen as restraint. So is this a possible kind of reform that might embody both or not? And then just the mere presence of security forces in places that didn't have the state before. So one of the, I don't know how this works. Actually, I actually can go to the research design for the experiments. Maybe? Yeah. So, so this county right here is Grand Cru County, and it's the most isolated county in Liberia. It has about 19 police officers right now for the entire county, and they're mostly just concentrated in the capital of that county. They don't have access to, they don't even have vehicles really. So the idea is to get at this idea of effectiveness. I want to see if you would take the state to places that have never really experienced the state, do they then see the state as effective? So I'm really trying to get at the interplay between restraint and effectiveness in the broader project. But in this particular paper, I don't include effectiveness, but in the future projects I do. So the second question, Yes, and so I am assuming that there's an immediate effect maybe, and that over time that may decay, and that's something that I'd really like to look at in the future. So this particular reform is still kind of relatively new. The 30% quota was put in place in 2012. There was a 15% quota immediately after in 2005, but there wasn't really a huge, you saw that right now it's at 19%, so they haven't really focused in on the implementation until recently. So that's maybe part of the reason why I'm seeing effects now. If I did a survey in 10 years, I would probably think that there shouldn't be an effect because of the fact that police institutions and military institutions are socializing institutions. So, but I think that restoring trust immediately is actually very important, right? In the meantime, then you can try to really rebuild these other areas that would then make the police perform better in general, which is really what's needed, right? We need the capacity in general, and right now they don't have that. They can barely respond to incidents. You need that initial perception boost at least, maybe.
Why don't we take a couple questions?
Jordan Tamo, who's mental foremost professor here. Question about one of the counter-arguments you mentioned. You mentioned the example of Afghanistan and the idea that in some cultures that are very conservative, perhaps this might not work the same way or might not work as well. Can you speak about to what extent, well, how would you describe Liberia culturally in terms of cultural attitudes about gender? And does your research suggest that, in fact, in communities that are culturally conservative about gender, these reforms still change attitudes in the way that you're describing? Or would you need to do research in a country that is more conservative in terms of gender attitudes, a place like Afghanistan, in order to kind of take on that counter-argument more directly? And to what extent do you think these reforms would be effective in the ways you've suggested in communities that are very conservative culturally?
Why don't we take a couple more, Susan?
Yeah, a couple points. I'm Susan Shepler, professor here. We met last night. Could it be that this you admitted that this is sort of an imposition of an idea that the police should be included? And could it be that this is related to Liberian sort of love of the United States, and so the fact that this is being imposed by the U.S. and others doesn't restore their confidence in their previous government? Instead, it sort of means that they don't like the Liberian government, and instead this is making them more close to the U.S. government or style. Does that make sense? I didn't say that very well. Second, you had your definition of legitimacy was preferring domestic forces and preferring peacekeepers to leave. So I also wonder whether preferring domestic forces might be because domestic forces are in fact more corrupt and closer to traditional ways of doing things and less effective in some sense. And that you might prefer peacekeepers to leave because they are corrupt in the wrong ways, or so it may not be about whether they're doing their job as security actors, but because of other elements of the way they function.
Let me take, I think Joe had his hand up, and then we'll come back to
Joe Young, thanks for the presentation. So I had a question about whether we think these female police officers are meeting people sort of randomly, and if the contact that people are having, it's just by chance, or if these women are being put in certain situations, and so certain people are being contacted. And if you dealt with that in terms of maybe matching or a selection model or some other tool.
Okay, why don't we come back to questions later?
Okay, so the scope conditions under which I think that this might apply based off of society. So there's the in-country variation, and then also the map that I showed you, lots of variation in states. I don't know at what the cutoff point is where this might work, and that's something that I think in future research that needs to be addressed, because Afghanistan is a very extreme case, right? But at the same time, you do have places like Iraq and that aren't maybe as extreme, but there's still quite rigid gender norms where we have implemented this policy. We haven't seen the same kind of violent backlash. So I would say, and at the same time, on the other side of the spectrum, right, we have countries like Sweden, or I mean up there was Spain and the UK, where you have very high levels of gender equality, and so maybe the stereotypes don't even exist, I don't know, you know. So I'm looking at the middle range is where I think that the policy is most likely to work. I don't necessarily have a good way to measure what that middle range is. So, you know, there's no like good measures of gender equality where I can say that I think this policy would work between this and this yet. So it's just kind of descriptively not at either extreme, is what I would think, and I think that also works internally in the country as well. So the two communities here were quite diverse in terms of ethnic groups, but you do have Mandingo communities that tend to be a little bit more conservative, and so you know, when I do actually the other field experiment can get at trying to see if there's something about Mandingo communities, so that's something I'll be able to tell in the future. Right now, within country, I mean, in terms of gender equality, the variation is still very small, but I mean, it is important to look at these other communities that might be more conservative. Susan. So this policy, the female racial balancing, was actually top down from the UN. The UN was was instrumental in the creation of the first quota, 15%. And the thing is that there's actually still quite very positive perceptions of the UN. So go back to here. I can show you this. Sorry, I'm just going to show you the. Actually, this way. So you can see that for think positively of the UN, both contact with female officers and no contact with female officers, those two groups. They both, about 84% or 83% of both groups still had very positive perceptions of the UN. And despite that, they still wanted the UN to leave when they had contact with women. So I don't think it's something about these other institutions that's doing the work, and I don't think that the policy is actually tied to the US. The US, people tend to know that the US is just training the emergency response unit and the police support unit, but I don't think there's this understanding that that particular policy is related to the US, so I don't think it's tied to that. And then, yes, so are they preferring the police because it's closer to what they know in terms of corruption? I think generally people want the police to perform better. And the alternative was a traditional leader. So they had the option to say that they wanted to go to a traditional leader, which would be the closest to what is most traditional. So and they're not picking that even when they have contact with women. So they're still tending to pick police officers. So I think people really do want the state to be involved in some issues, not all maybe. Things like domestic violence, for example, I think is still something that people don't want the state to respond to. Rape has become that way, I think, because of the so much attention focused on SGBV. So for the particular issues that I looked at, I think the preference is still for the state. So then Joe, okay, so let me explain how the contact variable works. So they were asked whether or not they had contact with a female officer, and the minimal requirement for that was whether or not they had a conversation with the police officer. And then they were asked if the female officer took the case, and that's a separate variable. Contact is most likely to happen at a police station, and the police stations, there's 2 police stations, one in each of these communities. They're about 30 to 50% women, so and it depends on the time of day and like all that stuff, which is quite random. The selection for people is quite random actually into the police stations. So the assumption that I make is that, of course there's a bias when people are going to the police, which is the sample that I'm trying to get at anyway. But whether or not when they get to the police station they are contacting a woman or a man, I think that's a sign regulate. At least it's kind of an as-if assumption. And then I think that the balance shows that both sides, both contact with female officers and no contact, are similar populations, minus the contact with female peacekeeper, which I control for. That's the best I can do here without the experiment. So.
Right.
Oh my goodness, okay. So I had people from the last round, Steve, and then Chuck, and then I saw Carol's hand first, and we'll come back to you all in the next round.
Hi, Stephen Tanktal, professor here. Thank you very much. It was a great presentation. A couple questions. One, you talked about early on sort of, the difficulties that the United States has had, especially in terms of building partner capacity, and you mentioned Iraq and Afghanistan. And one of the things, obviously, that those countries, are different there than Liberia is you have ongoing conflicts versus a post-conflict situation. So I'd be curious in terms of, with regard to your larger research agenda, how you look at that, right, in terms of instituting some of these reforms in a place where the conflict is still ongoing versus one where the conflict is completed and perhaps the United States has, and the UN and others have a different set of interests, right, once that conflict has ended. And then the second, coming back to sort of your point about Afghanistan's and Jordan's in terms of gender integration, I mean, there's other types of inclusivity that we've tried to encourage in Afghanistan, ethnic, in particular, Tajik, Uzbek. And I'm wondering when you sort of expand it and you look at different types of integration, if you also sort of look at, because you define security sector reform quite broadly, whether you look at differences in terms of army versus police versus judiciary. I mean, right, you could blow this out in a lot of different directions, and so I'd be curious, if it matters in terms of, how you select which is going to be the most important institution.
Just respect to ethnic balancing or in general?
Yeah. Ethnic or gender, I mean, in general, right?
Hi, I'm Chuck Paul, so thanks for the presentation. I have questions that are a little bit along the lines of some of the earlier ones, but so I did, when I was, a grad student in the 1990s, I did a bunch of research on police reforms in El Salvador and Haiti and UN missions then. And so it's good to see you bringing this. I didn't do survey work. It's really nice to see you doing survey work and bringing some empirics to some of these questions. And I think that's great. But I want to ask a question, like sort of it's a rather this looking at composition questions of, which is one of the things that I did, basically make a strong argument based on the Salvador case as well as Haiti, that the international community is looking very much at technical capacity building kinds of reforms as being the ticket, rather than composition questions. And I think composition questions are rather important. And so I guess I want to ask you to think more broadly about, you've looked at this particular type of composition reform and whether it has an effect or not. And I guess I want to say this is sort of an old school kind of approach on the gender fronts at least, right? So there's lots of critiques early on. So I was there when they put in women police in Haiti, and then the women police basically had to beat the suspects more than the male police, along the lines of what Miles was suggesting, in order to show that they were real policemen to their colleagues. So you have this behavior where they're socialized by the institution, and that there's clear evidence of that happening there. And so then the gender critique of that is, okay, it's not just about composition, it's about the conduct of the police, it's about transforming organizational approaches and so on and so forth. And so I want to ask on the gender front, are you looking at how this composition question compares to some of the conduct, accountability, other kinds of questions, institutional approaches, right? And then also, this top-down, as you acknowledged in your paper, and other things that you've written, the top-down approach is sort of critiqued by lots of people these days. It's way out of favor. So what do you say to people who say, why don't you, have you looked at places where they have tried to have more participation in questions about policing, such as community involvement in selection, community involvement in identifying who they want to be candidates for police, which was an issue also in Haiti, community involvement in whether or not they care about women police or other kinds of police, whether or not the ethnic question is more important than the women, for example, those kinds of questions. The third thing I want to ask about is I just find the causality puzzling here and quite a leap, and I'm not convinced about wanting the UN to leave on that particular question, right? And so I've been sitting here thinking, what could that really be? I don't think when you walk in and have a contact with a Liberian woman police officer, then you just decide, yeah, the UN can leave now. So what is that? And I noticed in your stats that there's a big difference between contact with female UN peacekeepers versus non-police keepers. And so that makes more sense to me, and maybe that's what's driving that, which is that when you talk to the UN police officers, you might say, wow, they don't know what the hell's going on in this country. And they're not that responsive, and so, geez, I think they should leave. That's it.
Okay, Carol, last.
So, thanks for this presentation, it's really interesting, and I love that you want to take it to Latin America. I do work in Mexico on bilateral policing related to drug cartels. And so, this is kind of not a fully fleshed out question, so I don't expect a fully fleshed out answer. But the problem in Mexico is twofold. One, that it's ongoing conflict. And two, except for a few places in Michoacan and Guerrero, and at one point in Tijuana, you didn't have a wiping away of the old police and a rebuilding from scratch. So what you have are these kind of networks of corruption. There are just these giant kickback schemes all the way up from the beat cop, who's required to kick back something to the commander, who's required to kick back something to the, the version of a sheriff, who's then required to kick back to the military. I mean, it's like all up. So if you were going to measure this in a place like that where the conflict is ongoing and you have extant corrupt schemes that aren't going to change unless you literally wipe clean all the various people that can put pressure to bear on the people below to kick back bribes and whatnot, which means that you have to be coercive in your policing. How could you measure security sector reform? Because it is happening in Mexico. I'm not sure it's happening very well, but it is happening. So how would you be able to test something like this in a context, maybe not just Mexico, where the conflict is still ongoing and the policing structures haven't been kind of wiped clean? They're still there. But again, not a fully fleshed out answer, because we're not doing research there.
Okay. I think your question ties into Stephen's question about ongoing conflict in general. So I think the assumption that I do make in this paper is that a conflict does have to end, and we kind of know that it has ended. I think this ties into the effectiveness question and response, right? I think the effectiveness of the security forces is going to be much more of a mechanism or a process that's going to be valued in those contexts where the conflict might be very much. But the problem is, right, and it's not like the U.S. has not focused on trying to build capacity, right? I mean, they are training forces and training them in how to use arms and things like that. But so when you do have a third party coming in and kind of implementing the right types of reforms, in this case capacity increasing reforms, and it's still not working, then that's maybe somewhat puzzling. But and how do you do that? I don't have the magic solution to that. Obviously, if we did the news articles like the one that we did, but I think that what that suggests is that we really need to think of the types of reforms that we have done there and what other countries have done in a conflict situation, goes into your question, and see that variation in implementation and see whether or not which ones have been more successful than others in the capacity increasing reforms, right? So do you right away start with creating special forces, creating this elite unit that's going to go in, or do you just focus more on recruitment and creating a larger force that's maybe not quite as teched up in quotes, but has more presence throughout the country? So these are the kinds of questions that I think would be important when it comes to effectiveness, right? And so we can think of effectiveness, restraint, inclusiveness, and transformation as kind of 4 different mechanisms that we can look at. I think this ties into your question. Your question is more about how would I then measure when the conflict is ongoing. I think that's really hard because I think there's a lot of ethical issues that would come to doing something like that in the field. Doing some kind of a needs assessment would be great. So going to communities and just doing a survey about what kinds of reforms they'd like to see in the securities, in their own security forces. So maybe it is that they're going to say, you just need a clean slate, and recruit different kinds of people, and rebuild from scratch. Maybe that's what they would say. So I would say that the starting place for maybe even in Iraq and Afghanistan places is, maybe, I don't know if we did a needs assessment when we went there. You know, did we ask the community what they thought the effectiveness meant? I don't know the answer to that. That would be where I would start when it comes to countries that are with ongoing conflicts. Okay. Other types of. Okay, so I'm just going to go to check your questions, which I think are important. Yeah, so I have a broad definition of security sector reform because I want to look at composition and technical changes and look at a wider range of possible responses. And I think there's a lot of information in the practice of how security sector reform has been done in the past that, like you said, has been kind of ignored, and then there's this lull in trying to understand security forces, and now maybe it's slowly coming back in a different identity of, you know, state building in Iraq and Afghanistan. I haven't really thought about. I haven't measured accountability. See if I can try to get at your question about whether or not these kinds of reforms speak to accountability and kind of good governance, maybe corruption issues. So I had, I just implemented another survey in the same two communities, and there I do have some questions about corruption and representation to kind of see if there's any relationship there. I'd have to theorize more about the connection between reform and good governance. This is mostly just about security response and how I'm defining legitimacy. So I'm not really incorporating corruption and other measures of accountability into the concept of legitimacy at this point, which is maybe something I should change in the future. And then the causality is not being convincing. So it seems a little puzzling, you know, upfront about why, you know, there's kind of a skip. And that's why there's two mechanisms, an indirect and a direct mechanism, right? So contact with women leads to enhanced perceptions of the domestic security forces, and it's really when people have confidence in the domestic security force that they're okay with the third party leaving. But what's really puzzling though is that even in the models when I'm controlling for that, there's still a direct effect, and that's where I think it's really it is really about this visible change, because people still have very positive perceptions of the UN mission there. It's at 84% people think favorably of the UN in this particular survey. And even when peacekeeping missions do bad things, like actually which has been the case in Liberia, so the other paper that I have that's forthcoming is on transactional sex with the UN peacekeepers. And of all the people that have transactional sex, all the women, 18 to 30, that engage in transactional sex, over half of that is with the UN peacekeeper. And those people that have transactional sex actually have a better perception of the UN mission. Like they actually see it more positively. So even you know, when we think that the mission might have these negative externalities, people still see them positively. So it's really about when the right time is for them to exit, and that's where I think the reforms could be a useful signal. Do I think that the mission should leave as soon as, you know, there's 30% women? No, I think it's a part of a set of reforms that are necessary, but that could still signal a shift in people's perceptions, at least, from being okay and trusting their own government.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah,
Of course, we live in a world where we think that there's a rational decision about exiting that has to do with state capacity.
Yeah.
But in fact, the exit of peacekeeping forces is usually due to Security Council determination in some other country, or the government saying we want you out
Yeah.
because there's no extra time.
Yeah, no, and so I think that's actually really important, because then because it's not decided by what's going on. I mean, sometimes it's decided by what's going on the ground, but there's sometimes maybe a mismatch, right? Maybe they should be leaving sooner or later than they actually are.
So, Maria and Team
Yeah,
and Garrett?
first.
Okay. You're in my group.
Thanks, Sabrina. This is really interesting. It seems in an analysis of gender and peacekeeping with regard to the security state, it would also be of a lot of importance to understand the role of gender and peacekeeping in the traditional leadership. It looked like obeying traditional leadership, or these kind of community systems, elder councils. And it seems in your research that you juxtapose them, kind of dichotomize them. And I think you had mentioned earlier when after the surveys, a participant can donate money either to the police force or to the community groups that are traditional justice providers or prevention providers. So I wanted to know, what is the role of gender and women leadership in the traditional quote-unquote realm, and if that is juxtaposed, or really a dichotomy, is it either or in terms of community trust? And then my other question had to do with, this is an analysis of the legitimacy of the security sector, which is different than the legitimacy of the state. You know, in terms of the state a state is more than a provider of security, so the state is providing education, infrastructure, or failing to provide rural development or agricultural subsidies or various things. So wouldn't other community and social and population responses to the failures of the state in other dimensions, rural development and other things, impact their understanding of the state legitimacy, even with regard to the security sector, which is one arm of the state?
All right.
So thank you so much, Sabrina. I agree, it was a very interesting talk. Maria de Jesus, by the way. My question had to do with, so you look at these three mechanisms as you explained, the restraint, inclusiveness, and visible transformation. And I was curious if you were considering, or maybe have in other papers, the role of training, simply training these security forces. And this is coming out of beyond gender, so beyond the gender composition, the role of training and the effects specifically on legitimacy, which you talked about in the buy-in of the community members of the security forces. It's coming out of an experience that I had this summer doing research that's not at all related to this in Central America, and particularly the Northern Triangle region in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, where that was one of the things that people talked about in this environment of generalized violence. You know, beyond the fact that there might have been men and women, and sort of a little bit more of a gender balance, it wasn't completely gender balanced, but they didn't think that they were professionally trained, that they weren't doing their jobs, period, that they were texting, you know, and this is middle of the day National Plaza in San Salvador. So you're sort of looking around and you're thinking, there is no security here, even though state is saying that there's security, right? That they actually have a security tax around protection of its citizens, and you have polices and you have private guards everywhere. There's a sense in which it's false sense of security. And the role of the training of these folks to actually make them legitimate bodies of security. I was curious to see your thoughts on that.
Anyone else? Okay.
Great. So, yeah, so in the responses, people actually had the option to choose a women's group to respond to, and actually not a single person chose a women's group. And so that, I think the reason for that is because it is kind of tended to be lumped together under traditional leadership. And so in communities you have, so hierarchy, so you have traditional leaders, which are all men all the time, and then you have the council of elders, you have a youth group, and you have a women's group, and those are kind of subcategories after the traditional leadership. So all of that is kind of encompassed in traditional leadership. So that's why I don't think there's too much of a difference there. So this money measure that you're talking about, I didn't actually implement in this survey. This is one of the behavioral measures in the experiments that I'm doing. So what will happen is, so some villages are getting visits by female police officers, some villages are getting, some households are getting visits by female officers only, some households are getting visits by male officers only, and some households are not getting any visits. So there will be a survey in all of the villages, and then it's actually ongoing, it's happening right now. So, and one of the measures at the end is that they'll be given money at the end of completing the survey as a thank you, and then they'll have the option to donate some money either to the police force for it to perform better, or to the community to make the community response for security better. So then I'll be able to see, you know, if that visit actually contributed to people contributing more to the state, basically as kind of a tax, right? It's kind of like the idea of a tax, if they would be more likely to pay a tax to the state. Legitimacy of the state versus security. So yes, in this paper, I'm only just looking at the legitimacy of the security sector because you know, I think that if we were going to see any kind of effect, it would just be for the security sector, because that's what the reform is targeted at. However, I think that if the state isn't performing on other levels, then that does have a detriment to the reform, right? So even if we have women in the security forces and then people are very excited, I think there's a reform, they go to the police station and then they have a terrible experience, or even the case makes it to the courts and then the court doesn't do anything with it, I think that could have a bad effect on the state, definitely, legitimacy for the state. I don't know if that does anything, again, to the police officer. I don't know where the blame would lie necessarily, but I think we need to start somewhere. And because the security sector maybe is oftentimes prioritized in state building, that's where I'm starting, is trying, and people are most fearful, right? It's the security sector that was involved in the atrocities and all of the stuff during the war, so that's where I think there's the biggest trust gap, right? So that's what I'm focusing on there. Yeah, and then the role of training. So training is extremely important, but here's the problem. How do people know who's been trained and to what extent? So what's the visible transformation aspect of training? And that's where I think it's key. So if there's a way to publicly demonstrate that police officers have been trained, and maybe even by whom, I think that would be a really interesting, future study, because I think while training improves performance, that's something that's, longer term people might realize that institutionally there's a change, things are working better, but that happens over time. The visible transformation mechanism here, like I said, is very short-term, instantaneous, potentially, right? So we want the short-term benefit of people perceiving the security sector to be reformed. Now there's ways that we can communicate that training. So maybe you change uniforms, right? So people that have undergone training receive some kind of a new uniform. Maybe they receive some kind of a badge that's visible to people. These are all things that I don't think have ever been done, but it's very possible to do, and it would be also a very interesting thing to test in the future. I can tell you that professionalization and training improves the overall performance of units. So in the lab and the field experiments, when I looked at the integration of women and the integration of minorities, groups that had a higher level of competency, so better training, they performed better on all of the activities that they did, and they actually performed better on gender equality, so they tended to treat their female colleagues better as well. So there's all kinds of side benefits, but those are the benefits that aren't being communicated to the public.
Right. Just a final point, everything you've talked about today could apply to the United States. I mean, we're talking about developing countries, but it would be worth thinking about doing a blog post at some point, and how these issues recur for all police forces over time, especially this restraint versus effectiveness, which is playing out in DC right now, and many American cities, and the inclusiveness issue, and how effective it is in actually changing the performance of police forces. So I mean, just a thought when you're further along in your research, perhaps, you might want to indicate that this is not something that's just Liberia, I mean, and developing countries.
Thank you.
Okay. And Boaz and Brandon. Okay.
So, my question is about policy implication, and one of the mechanisms you talk about, the mechanism of restraint, is basically built, the effect there is built on a stereotype that may not be true about women in policing. So if you are an advisor to a post-conflict country, and you advise him or her to implement this kind of reform, in a sense you advise him reform based on a stereotype that you know might not be true. Just what your thoughts about that?
Brandon Sim, second year PhD student. So this is kind of setting aside the causality question, but looking at how you measured the perceptions, especially of visible transformation. So you said that you're focusing just on surveying those who had interaction with the female police officers. I'm curious, though, the visible transformations and in your policy seems to focus more on how the general population perceives the security sector. And I'm curious how the possible interaction might be. For example, we might think maybe in the traditional communities that haven't had a response with the female police officers, maybe it's more negative and so it balances out, or maybe there's some diffusion. I'm just curious your thoughts about that, especially because I'm wondering if the mechanism you're actually getting at then is responsiveness of female police officers. Like if they feel that the female police officers are more responsive to them, then that's driving the positive perceptions, whereas those who don't have the interaction, you know, might not have that effect. I'm just curious.
I don't think I would make a recommendation based off of gender stereotypes. I think that's the wrong way that I would frame it to people, even though maybe there's evidence for that. I would suggest to policymakers in particular states to implement this reform, maybe in targeted areas if they don't have the resources, but I would play up the fact that it's also the right thing to do. Integrating more women into security forces in general as an issue of equality is a good thing. And then I would also kind of maybe make the visible transformation argument, which doesn't really rely on stereotypes. It's just basically just a signaling mechanism, and say that if you integrate more women, people might notice that there's a change in security forces. So this could be a good thing. And then I would also say, and it might be a good thing to do just to integrate more women, at least open up positions, maybe not have a quota policy, but not have a restriction either, so that if women did want, and to encourage, to make it more possible for women to be able to come into the security forces, and providing, education and encouragement to women that might want to join the police forces. And then Brandon, so the mechanism of responsiveness. I don't think women police officers are more responsive. There's no reason to suggest that they would be more responsive because the resources at both the police stations are limited. So, and that's not based off of sex, right? So women aren't going to get more resources to go respond to things. So in general, the overall capacity is low. And so if female officers or any police officers were to respond, usually it takes people that come to the police stations to actually have to pay something for them to be able to do things. So most of the contact is not police responding to things necessarily, but rather people coming to the police station and interacting with the front desk, like people that happen to be there to take their case or write it down or talk to them about their case, and that's, I think it's random, right? And so, I know that the process is at least not systematic for assigning police officers. Like they don't assign more women to particular communities because they're just gender based on it, so they're just going to put in no clue. They just kind of, whoever's available, we just kind of send them around, so, yeah.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Brandon. It was a wonderful